The knock didn't sound like a knock at all, it sounded like something breaking. It came in uneven bursts, wood rattling against the frame, a rhythm that felt panicked rather than polite. I had been half asleep on the couch, the TV murmuring to itself in the background, when the noise tore through the apartment and snapped me fully awake. My heart leapt before my thoughts could catch up, that instinctive surge that tells you something is wrong before you know what it is. I remember sitting there for a second longer than I should have, listening to the silence between the knocks, trying to decide whether this was an emergency or a mistake that would get me hurt if I answered it. What happened next was rather unexpected. I will tell you everything, but first, if you enjoy stories like this, you want to be part of the 10% viewers who click on the like button. It makes us really happy. If you are yet to subscribe to our channel, kindly support us today by subscribing to this channel. This helps us to bring you more beautiful stories. It will be great to tell us where you are watching us from in the comment section. When I finally stood and moved toward the door, I told myself I was being cautious, not curious. The hallway outside was usually quiet at that hour, a place of routine sounds and predictable faces. This wasn't routine. Through the peephole, I saw my neighbor slumped against the wall, one hand pressed to their side, the other braced awkwardly against the door as if standing upright took more effort than they had to give. Their face was pale, eyes wide and unfocused, breathing shallow and uneven. When I cracked the door open, just enough to hear them, they leaned in close and whispered, "Hide me. They'll harm us both." The words landed hard, heavy with a certainty that left no room for exaggeration. I opened the door wider without consciously deciding to. Shock has a way of doing that, of bypassing the careful systems you think you live by and replacing them with raw reaction. They stumbled forward, nearly losing their balance, and I caught their arm instinctively. There was blood on their sleeve, not gory or dramatic, just enough to make the situation undeniably real. I remember thinking how quiet their voice was compared to the violence of the knock, how controlled their fear sounded, like someone who knew exactly how little time they had left. Somewhere down the hall, I heard raised voices, sharp and impatient, and my chest tightened as the implication of they became terrifyingly immediate. I pulled them inside and closed the door behind us, my hands shaking as the lock slid into place. The apartment felt suddenly too small, the walls thinner than they had ever seemed before. My neighbor leaned against the counter, eyes darting toward the door as if expecting it to burst open at any second. I wanted to ask questions, who they were running from, what had happened, why they'd come to me, but none of those words made it past my throat. Instead, I stood there staring at the door, listening to my own pulse roar in my ears, realizing how quickly my quiet evening had turned into something that couldn't be undone. Fear arrived in layers, each one heavier than the last. First came the fear of immediate danger, the idea that whoever was looking for them might be just seconds behind. Then came the fear of consequence, the awareness that by opening the door, I had stepped into a situation with no neutral exit. I thought about calling the police, about shouting for help, about pretending none of this was happening. Every option felt inadequate, too slow, or dangerously visible. My neighbor looked at me then, really looked at me, and said my name the way someone says it when they're placing their last bet on you. "Please," they said quietly. "They're not bluffing." I told myself I didn't know this person well enough to make this kind of decision. We'd exchanged pleasantries in the hallway, complained about noise once or twice, nothing that built trust strong enough to risk my safety. And yet, standing there, I felt the weight of their fear pressing against me, making indifference feel impossible. This wasn't a story on the news or a hypothetical moral exercise. This was someone bleeding in my kitchen, someone who had chosen my door because they believed I might help. That belief sat heavily in my chest, demanding a response even as my mind screamed for caution. The sounds in the hallway grew louder, footsteps, voices overlapping in frustration. I could make out fragments of words but not meaning, just enough to know they were close. My neighbor's grip tightened on the edge of the counter, knuckles whitening as they fought to stay upright. I realized then that whatever choice I made would define the next few minutes of my life, and possibly much more than that. Doing nothing was a choice. Turning them away would be a choice. Hiding them would be a choice. Each carried its own risks, its own consequences I couldn't fully see yet. I motioned for them to move, guiding them toward the back of the apartment with a speed that surprised me. There was no plan, only instinct. The spare room was cluttered, barely used, but it had a door and a lock, flimsy as it was. I helped them inside, whispered for them to stay quiet, and closed the door gently, my heart pounding so hard I worried it might give us away. As I turned back toward the front of the apartment, a heavy impact slammed against my door, the frame shuddering under the force. The sound wasn't just loud, it was deliberate. "Open up," someone shouted from the other side, their voice edged with anger and impatience. I stood frozen for a second, the lie forming in my mind before I was fully aware of it. I had never considered myself a good liar. I preferred clarity, rules, staying out of trouble. Now, trouble was standing inches away from me, and clarity was nowhere to be found. I took a breath, forcing my shoulders to relax, trying to look like someone who hadn't just hidden an injured person in their home. My neighbor's words echoed in my head, "They'll harm us both," and I understood with chilling clarity that whatever happened next would bind us together whether I liked it or not. I approached the door slowly, every step feeling louder than it should have. My hand hovered near the lock, my mind racing through scenarios that ended badly no matter which path I chose. Outside, the voices shifted, impatience sharpening into something more volatile. I thought about my quiet life, about how carefully I'd built it to avoid exactly this kind of chaos. And I thought about how fragile that safety really was, how quickly it could be dismantled by a single knock and a plea whispered in fear. As I reached for the door, another impact shook it violently, the wood groaning in protest. The decision I'd been trying to delay made itself for me in that moment. I wasn't choosing heroism or recklessness. I was choosing involvement, because involvement had already been chosen for me the second I opened that door. Whatever lay on the other side of it now, there was no returning to the version of the night where this hadn't happened. Before I could decide anything else, something slammed against my door again, and I knew the night was only just beginning. I didn't open the door right away, and the silence that followed felt louder than the pounding itself. My mind scrambled for something solid to hold on to, some rule or procedure that could tell me what the right move was, but nothing applied cleanly to a situation like this. I was acutely aware of how exposed I was, how thin the door suddenly felt, how every breath sounded amplified in my own ears. I glanced once toward the back of the apartment, imagining my neighbor standing there in the dim light, injured and listening just as intently as I was. Whatever I said next wouldn't just be words. It would be a commitment. The pounding came again, harder this time, followed by a sharp voice demanding I open up. I recognized none of them, which didn't reassure me the way I thought it might. Strangers can be more dangerous than familiar threats, especially when they're angry and convinced they're entitled to something you have. I pressed my palm flat against the door, feeling the vibration of their movement on the other side, and took a breath deep enough to steady my voice. When I finally spoke, it surprised me how calm I sounded. "What do you want?" I asked, pitching my tone somewhere between irritation and confusion, the voice of someone inconvenienced rather than afraid. They claimed they were looking for someone, speaking quickly and over one another, frustration bleeding into their words. I listened carefully, not just to what they said but to how they said it. There was no mention of injury, no concern for well-being, only accusation and impatience. That detail mattered. It told me something about the power dynamic at play, about who they thought they were dealing with. When they demanded I step aside so they could take a look, something inside me hardened. The line between uncertainty and resolve snapped into place. "No one's here," I said, the lie landing fully formed before I'd consciously chosen it. I didn't stutter. I didn't hedge. I simply stated it as fact. The words hung in the air between us, fragile and dangerous. I felt a strange clarity settle in as soon as I said them, as if crossing that line had simplified everything. There was no middle ground now. I had lied, and that lie had a direction. It pointed forward, into consequences I couldn't yet see. They didn't believe me. I could hear it in the pause that followed, in the way the voices shifted from interrogation to calculation. One of them laughed, low and humorless, and told me not to make this harder than it needed to be. Another voice moved closer, close enough that I imagined their breath fogging the other side of the door. They insisted they knew the person they were looking for had come this way. My stomach clenched at the implication. They were confident, which meant my neighbor's fear hadn't been exaggerated. I told myself to keep it simple. Don't volunteer information. Don't escalate. Don't open the door. Each rule felt thin but necessary. When they demanded again that I unlock it, my refusal came more easily this time. I said I'd call the police if they didn't leave, even as my hand hovered near my phone, unsure whether that threat would protect me or provoke them. The idea that authorities might arrive too late, or worse, not be trusted by the people on the other side, flickered through my mind. The world outside my door felt unstable, governed by rules I didn't fully understand. From the back of the apartment came a faint sound, fabric shifting, a soft intake of breath, and my heart lurched. I prayed the walls would do their job, that sound wouldn't travel, that luck would hold for just a few more minutes. I raised my voice slightly, masking panic with annoyance, repeating that no one was there and that they needed to leave. The lie was no longer just a statement. It was a performance, one I had to sustain without letting cracks show. The pounding resumed, not as a demand now but as intimidation. The door shook under the force, and I pictured the lock giving way, splintering into uselessness. My apartment had always felt secure before, a place where danger stayed outside and life unfolded predictably. Now it felt like a stage, every object and shadow charged with potential. I backed away slightly, positioning myself so I could see the hallway mirror out of the corner of my eye, absurdly worried about how I looked in that moment, as if appearances still mattered. They began to threaten consequences, their voices sharpening into something ugly. They warned me not to get involved, not to protect someone who didn't deserve it. The implication was clear. In their version of events, I was already complicit. I wondered how many times they'd used that logic before, how often intimidation had worked for them. The realization fueled a stubborn streak I didn't know I had. If I opened the door now, it wouldn't end the situation, it would simply transfer it inside, where the damage would be harder to contain. Minutes stretched into something elastic and surreal. I was hyper-aware of every sensation. The cool air against my skin, the faint smell of blood still lingering from where my neighbor had leaned against the counter, the way my legs ached from standing rigid for so long. I thought about how easily this night could fracture my life, how a decision made under pressure could ripple outward into explanations, investigations, and consequences that lasted far longer than the danger itself. And yet, even with all that awareness, the idea of opening the door felt impossible. Eventually, the voices retreated slightly, shifting position as if reassessing. I didn't relax. I knew better than to assume it was over just because the noise changed. I stayed where I was, listening, counting breaths, willing my hands to stop shaking. When one of them shouted that they'd be back, and that I should think carefully about what side I wanted to be on. The words landed with a chill that lingered even after the hallway fell quiet again. I waited long after the footsteps faded before I moved, my muscles protesting as I finally stepped away from the door. The apartment felt altered, like it had absorbed the confrontation into its walls. I walked slowly toward the back room, every step measured, afraid of startling my neighbor or myself. When I opened the door, they looked up at me with a mixture of fear and gratitude that made my chest tighten. I told them they were gone, for now, and watched the tension drain slightly from their face, replaced by something heavier. Only then did the full weight of what I'd done settle in. I hadn't just reacted. I had committed. I had chosen a side, lied convincingly, and put myself directly in the path of whatever came next. There was no version of this night where I returned to the couch and forgot about it by morning. Whatever these people wanted, whatever my neighbor was tangled up in, I was now part of it. The safety of neutrality had vanished the moment I said, "No one's here." As I closed the door to the spare room again and leaned against the wall, exhaustion washed over me in a sudden wave. Fear still hummed under my skin, but alongside it was a strange, steady resolve. I didn't know if I was doing the right thing. I only knew I couldn't undo it now. The lie I'd told was alive, fragile, and demanding to be maintained. And somewhere deep down, I understood that this was only the beginning, that whatever truth my neighbor was running from would eventually come knocking too. They didn't believe me, and they weren't leaving for good. I didn't ask questions right away, and that choice surprised me almost as much as the situation itself. The words crowded my throat. Who are they? What did you do? Why you? But I swallowed them back, instinct telling me that answers given too soon might be incomplete or carefully shaped by fear. My neighbor sat on the edge of the spare bed, shoulders hunched, breathing shallow, one hand pressed firmly against the injury at their side. The room smelled faintly of dust and old linens, ordinary in a way that felt almost cruel given what had just unfolded. I handed them a towel and a glass of water, my movements deliberate, grounding myself in small, practical tasks while my mind raced ahead. When they finally spoke, it wasn't to explain anything. It was to apologize. The word landed awkwardly in the cramped space, heavy and insufficient. They said they hadn't meant to involve me, that they wouldn't have come if they'd had another option. I nodded, unsure what response would be honest without being cruel. Of course they hadn't meant to involve me. No one ever does when fear strips away choice. That apology, incomplete as it was, told me something important. Whatever they were running from, it wasn't something they wore lightly. It wasn't a game or a misunderstanding. It was a burden that had finally tipped over into urgency. I asked them how badly they were hurt, keeping my voice steady. They shrugged it off with a dismissive wave, but the wince that followed told a different story. I insisted on looking, my hands trembling slightly as I helped clean and bandage the wound as best I could. It wasn't catastrophic, but it wasn't nothing either. The injury looked recent, hurriedly tended before they'd reached my door. That detail gnawed at me. It suggested pursuit, escalation, a timeline that didn't leave room for careful planning. This wasn't a long-considered escape. It was a last resort. As I worked, fragments began to slip out, not explanations, not yet, but context. They mentioned a dispute that had gone wrong, people who didn't take no for an answer, a situation that had spiraled faster than expected. Each fragment felt deliberately vague, like they were testing how much they could say without crossing some invisible line. I listened closely, not just to the words but to what was missing. They didn't present themselves as innocent or blameless, but they didn't sound malicious either. There was regret there, and urgency, and a palpable fear of consequences that extended beyond themselves. At one point, I asked the question I'd been avoiding. Are they dangerous? The room seemed to hold its breath as they considered how to answer. Yes, they said finally, without hesitation. But not the way you're probably thinking. That distinction lodged in my mind, unsettling and incomplete. Dangerous how, then? Through violence? Influence? Reach? The ambiguity made my skin prickle. Danger that couldn't be easily categorized was harder to prepare for, harder to explain to authorities if this went further. I realized then how much I'd been relying on simple narratives, bad guys, clear threats, because complexity demanded more from me than fear alone. I stepped away from the bed and paced the small room, careful to keep my movements quiet. The apartment felt like it was holding a secret too large for its walls. Every sound, pipes settling, a car passing outside, made me flinch. I asked myself, not for the first time, whether I should have called for help already, whether I was compounding a mistake by waiting. But another thought followed close behind, calling without understanding could make things worse, not better. If my neighbor was right. If the people looking for them had reach or leverage, then exposing them prematurely might simply bring the danger back to my door with more authority and fewer options. When I pressed them again for clarity, their answer came reluctantly, eyes fixed on the floor. They said they'd been involved in something they believed was contained, controlled, temporary. They'd trusted the wrong people. They'd underestimated how far others were willing to go to protect their interests. The words were careful, chosen to convey seriousness without confession. I sensed there were details they couldn't, or wouldn't, share, not because they didn't trust me, but because speaking them out loud might solidify consequences they were still hoping to avoid. That restraint, oddly enough, made me trust them more. I realized then that my fear had shifted. At first, I'd been afraid of the people outside my door. Now, I was afraid of the unknown shape of the truth I was sheltering. Protecting someone innocent is one kind of risk. Protecting someone complicated is another entirely. I wondered whether my involvement was rooted in empathy or in a misplaced sense of responsibility. Had I chosen to help because it was right, or because turning away felt unbearable in the moment? The answer, I suspected, was both. And both came with costs. We sat in silence for a while after that, the kind that settles in when conversation has exhausted its safest edges. I watched my neighbor's breathing even out slightly, the immediate panic easing into something heavier and more controlled. I thought about the people who had been at my door, the confidence in their voices, the way they'd spoken as if they had the authority to demand entry. That authority didn't come from nowhere. It came from power, social, financial, institutional, or some uneasy combination of all three. The realization made my earlier threat to call the police feel suddenly naive. Power has a way of bending systems to its shape. I asked them the question that had been forming since the pounding stopped. Are they coming back? The answer came quickly. Yes. No hesitation. No qualifiers. The certainty in their voice chilled me. They added that the people searching for them didn't give up easily, and that my refusal at the door would be interpreted not as ignorance, but as opposition. I felt a tight knot form in my stomach. Opposition implied escalation. It implied that the lie I'd told wasn't a temporary shield, it was a line drawn. The weight of that realization pressed down on me, forcing a recalibration of everything I thought I was doing. I wasn't just hiding someone until things cooled off. I was now part of a standoff I hadn't consented to with full information. I asked myself, again, whether I could still step back, still redirect this to someone better equipped to handle it. But the image of those faces outside my door, the threat in their voices, told me stepping back wouldn't reset anything. It would simply remove the one barrier currently complicating their plans. My neighbor looked at me then with a directness that made me hold their gaze. They told me they understood if I wanted them to leave, that they'd find somewhere else, that they didn't want to make things worse for me. The offer felt hollow, not because it wasn't sincere, but because we both knew it wasn't viable. Leaving now would put them directly back in harm's path, and it would mark me as someone who had interfered and then folded. Neither outcome felt safer than the uncertainty we were already sitting in. I told them to rest, to conserve energy, buying myself time to think. As I closed the spare room door again, my mind churned with contingency plans that all felt inadequate. Call a friend? Too risky. Leave the apartment? Abandoning it wouldn't erase my involvement. Stay put and hope? Hope felt like the least reliable strategy of all. I leaned against the wall, pressing my forehead into the cool paint, and exhaled slowly. I wasn't panicking, but I wasn't calm either. I was suspended between urgency and restraint, waiting for the next move to reveal itself. The truth, I realized, wasn't something I was going to receive in a neat explanation. It was something I would uncover through consequence. Whatever my neighbor was running from had already spilled into my life, and the shape of it would become clearer not through confession, but through pressure. I didn't know yet whether I was protecting someone who deserved it or simply someone desperate enough to risk everything. What I did know was that backing out now would come with its own reckoning, one I wasn't prepared to face. As I stood there listening to the quiet, a dull thud echoed faintly from somewhere below, perhaps a door closing, perhaps footsteps in the stairwell, and my pulse jumped in response. The night wasn't finished with us. The people who had come looking hadn't been satisfied. And the truth my neighbor was carrying, heavy and incomplete, was already shaping the path ahead, whether I understood it or not. By the time I realized what they were really running from, it was already too late to back out. The second time they came back, there was no knocking at all. One moment the building was wrapped in that brittle, late-night quiet that makes every sound feel amplified, and the next there was a violent crash against my door that rattled the walls hard enough to make something fall in the kitchen. The impact wasn't exploratory or impatient, it was decisive. Purposeful. My body reacted before my mind could catch up, adrenaline surging so fast it made my hands feel numb. Whatever chance I'd imagined still existed for de-escalation vanished in that instant. They weren't here to ask anymore. I barely had time to step back before another blow landed, wood splintering with a sharp crack that cut through me like ice. The lock groaned, metal straining against its housing, and I understood with terrifying clarity that the door was not going to hold. I glanced toward the hallway, toward the spare room where my neighbor was hiding, and felt a surge of panic sharpen into resolve. This was no longer about lying convincingly or maintaining a facade. This was about survival, mine and theirs, and the knowledge that whatever happened next would leave marks far deeper than broken furniture. Shouts echoed through the hallway, voices raised not in anger now but in command. They were coordinating, calling out positions, treating my apartment like an obstacle rather than a boundary. The realization made my stomach drop. These weren't just angry people acting on impulse. They were organized. Prepared. And they didn't care about the damage they caused getting what they wanted. I backed toward the hallway instinctively, positioning myself between the door and the rest of the apartment, my heart hammering so hard it felt like it might shake loose. The next impact tore the lock free. The door buckled inward, hanging uselessly on its hinges, and a rush of cold air and noise flooded the apartment. I didn't think, I reacted. I shouted for them to stop, my voice cracking with a mix of fear and fury that surprised me. For a split second, the chaos paused, as if my presence hadn't been fully accounted for. Then they pushed inside anyway, their momentum carrying them past the threshold I'd tried so desperately to defend. Time fractured in that moment, stretching and compressing all at once. I remember faces, hard, focused, impatient. I remember one of them scanning the apartment with a practiced eye, already dismissing me as an inconvenience rather than a threat. Someone shoved past me, shoulder clipping mine hard enough to make me stumble, and I caught myself on the wall, the impact knocking the air from my lungs. Panic flared hot and sharp, but beneath it was something steadier, more dangerous, anger. Not rage, but the clear, burning certainty that they had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. I yelled again, louder this time, demanding they leave, threatening police, consequences, anything that might slow them down. My words barely registered. One of them grabbed my arm briefly, not to restrain me, but to move me out of the way, treating me like furniture that had been poorly placed. The casual disregard for my presence made my skin crawl. This wasn't personal to them. That somehow made it worse. Violence born of indifference is harder to reason with than violence born of emotion. From the back of the apartment came a sound I'd been dreading, a muffled thump, the scrape of movement as my neighbor reacted to the noise. Head snapped toward the hallway instantly. I felt the shift in the room like a physical force, attention narrowing, intent sharpening. Someone swore under their breath, and another moved decisively toward the spare room. I pushed off the wall and stepped into their path without thinking, my pulse roaring in my ears. "No," I said, my voice louder and steadier than I felt. The word surprised me with its force. It wasn't a plea. It was a refusal. For a moment, it worked. They stopped, eyes flicking between me and the closed door behind me, reassessing. That pause, brief and fragile, felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing the ground could give way at any second. What followed was a blur of raised voices and threats, words overlapping in a chaotic chorus that stripped away any illusion of control. They told me to move. They warned me again not to get involved. They made promises that felt less like negotiations and more like inevitabilities. I held my ground not because I believed I could stop them, but because stepping aside felt like surrendering something essential, something I wouldn't be able to reclaim afterward. The situation tipped when sirens cut through the night outside, distant but unmistakable. The sound changed everything. The people in my apartment stiffened, their urgency recalibrating instantly. Someone cursed. Someone else barked an order. In seconds, the energy shifted from pursuit to retreat. They backed away from the hallway, eyes still sharp, still assessing, but now calculating exit routes instead of entry points. One of them looked at me then, really looked at me, and the expression on their face wasn't anger. It was recognition. They didn't apologize. They didn't threaten me again. They simply left, moving fast and efficiently, disappearing into the hallway as abruptly as they'd arrived. The apartment fell silent in their wake, the absence of noise almost as disorienting as the violence had been. I stood there shaking, my limbs heavy and uncooperative, staring at the ruined door as if it might explain what had just happened. When I finally turned toward the spare room, my legs nearly gave out. I knocked once, softly, then opened the door to find my neighbor standing there, pale and rigid, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and something else, relief edged with guilt. They looked at the broken doorway behind me and then back at my face, their expression collapsing into horror. I could see the weight of what I'd taken on settling fully onto them now, the realization that my involvement was no longer theoretical. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. The night had stripped language down to its bare essentials, and words felt inadequate. The damage was done, not just to the apartment, but to the invisible boundary between my life before this night and whatever came after. The people who had come looking hadn't succeeded in taking my neighbor, but they had succeeded in changing everything else. Safety, anonymity, routine, all of it lay splintered alongside my front door. As the sirens grew closer, red and blue light flickering faintly through the windows, I felt a strange, grounding clarity settle over me. The choice I'd made earlier, opening the door, lying, standing my ground, had carried me here, to this moment. There was no undoing it now. The threshold had been crossed in every sense of the word, and the consequences were no longer abstract. They were standing in my hallway, undeniable and permanent. The moment they forced their way inside, I knew this night would follow me forever. The silence after they left was deceptive, the kind that feels temporary even as it stretches on, daring you to believe it's over. My ears rang as if the noise had etched itself into my head, and every creak of the building made my muscles tense all over again. I stood in the middle of the apartment staring at the broken door, wood splintered and hanging at an angle that made the space feel exposed and unfamiliar. It wasn't just damage, it was proof. Proof that this had happened, that I hadn't imagined the violence or exaggerated the threat. The night had left its mark, and it was going to demand attention whether I wanted to give it or not. The authorities arrived soon after, their presence filling the hallway with a different kind of weight. Questions came in careful sequences, voices neutral but probing, eyes tracking the room with trained precision. I answered slowly, choosing each word with a deliberateness I didn't know I was capable of under pressure. I told the truth where I could and stayed deliberately vague where I couldn't, aware that my version of events mattered now in ways it hadn't before. Every sentence felt like a balance between honesty and protection, between cooperation and the instinct to shield the person still hiding behind my bedroom door. When they asked if anyone else had been in the apartment, my chest tightened. I could feel my neighbor's presence like a held breath, a silent question hovering just out of sight. I paused, then said no. The word carried more weight this time than it had at the door earlier. This wasn't a lie meant to stall or deflect. This was a line I was drawing deliberately, knowing it might carry consequences I couldn't yet predict. I watched the officer's face carefully as I spoke, searching for doubt, suspicion, or relief. I saw none of it. Only professional neutrality that offered no reassurance either way. After they left, the apartment felt impossibly empty despite the damage. The adrenaline drained out of me all at once, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion that made my limbs feel heavy and unresponsive. I sat on the floor with my back against the wall, staring at nothing, replaying moments from the night on an endless loop. The way the door gave way. The sound of voices shifting from demand to command. The brief look of recognition in one of their eyes before they left. Each memory lodged itself deeper, refusing to fade into something distant or abstract. My neighbor emerged slowly from the spare room, moving like someone unsure whether the ground beneath them was still solid. They stopped short when they saw the damage, their face tightening with a mix of shock and guilt that cut through me more sharply than fear had. They started apologizing again, words tumbling over each other, but I raised a hand to stop them. I didn't want apologies. I wanted clarity, or at least something close to it. The cost of helping had finally become visible, and it demanded acknowledgement, not justification, but understanding. They told me more than, not everything, but enough to fill in the shape of what I'd stepped into. Not a confession, not a clean narrative, but context that reframed the night in grimly practical terms. There were disputes that had turned hostile, interests that didn't tolerate interference, people who operated outside the lines most of us rely on for protection. My neighbor hadn't been innocent, but they hadn't been malicious either. They'd been expendable, and they'd realized it too late. That realization had driven them to my door, bleeding and desperate, willing to risk involving me because the alternative was worse. I listened without interrupting, the weight of it settling slowly into place. This wasn't a story with heroes and villains arranged neatly on opposite sides. It was a collision of bad choices, power, and fear, and I'd been caught in the middle because I happened to be home when someone ran out of options. Understanding that didn't make the damage disappear. It didn't restore my sense of safety or undo the lie I'd told. But it grounded the night in reality, stripping away any temptation to dramatize what had happened. This wasn't destiny or bravery. It was consequence. In the days that followed, the aftermath unfolded in quieter, more insidious ways. Repairs were made. Statements were reviewed. I fielded follow-up calls that asked the same questions in slightly different ways, each repetition wearing at the edges of my patience. Friends noticed I was distracted, distant, carrying something I didn't name. I slept lightly, waking at every unfamiliar sound, my body remembering the night even when my mind tried to move past it. The incident became something people referenced in careful tones, a disruption to be managed rather than a trauma to be acknowledged. My neighbor disappeared not long after, leaving quietly, taking only what they could carry. There was no dramatic goodbye, no promise to stay in touch. Just a brief exchange of looks that held gratitude, regret, and an understanding that whatever bond had formed between us was forged under pressure and didn't need maintenance to remain real. Watching them go, I felt a strange mix of relief and loss. Their presence had been the catalyst, but their absence didn't erase what had happened. The night lingered, etched into my sense of space and trust. What surprised me most was how alone I felt afterward. Not abandoned. Unsupported in a different way. There was no script for processing something like this, no socially accepted way to talk about choosing to help and paying a price for it. People wanted reassurance that everything was fine now, that danger had passed. And on the surface, it had. But underneath that reassurance was a deeper awareness that safety wasn't as stable as I'd once believed. That realization didn't make me afraid, it made me vigilant in a way that couldn't be turned off. I found myself questioning decisions I'd never questioned before. How quickly I'd judged risk. How easily I'd assumed neutrality was possible. How little I'd considered the cost of doing nothing versus doing something imperfect. Helping my neighbor hadn't been clean or uncomplicated. It hadn't ended neatly once the immediate threat was gone. It had followed me into interviews, into quiet moments, into the way I now listened for sounds in the hallway. The aftermath was a long echo, and no one had warned me how far it would travel. And yet, even as the weight of it pressed down on me, I knew something with a clarity that surprised me. I would make the same choice again. Not because it had been easy or noble, but because the alternative, closing the door and living with that silence, would have followed me just as relentlessly. Helping them hadn't just saved a life. It had altered mine, reshaping how I understood responsibility and risk in ways that couldn't be reversed. Helping them hadn't just saved a life, it had changed mine. The weeks that followed didn't resolve themselves into a clean ending the way I half expected they might. There was no moment where I woke up and felt finished with the night, no clear line where fear ended and normal life resumed. Instead, everything softened around the edges, slowly and unevenly, like bruises fading in different shades at different speeds. I went back to work, resumed conversations, answered messages with practiced normalcy, but underneath it all was a quiet recalibration I couldn't switch off. I moved through my days aware that something fundamental had shifted, not in my circumstances, but in how I understood my place inside them. People asked if I was okay, and I learned quickly how to answer without answering. "I'm fine" became shorthand for "I survived something I can't neatly explain." What they really wanted was reassurance that the world still worked the way they believed it did, that danger was rare, distant, and clearly labeled. I couldn't give them that without lying in a way that felt dishonest even to myself. So I offered something smaller, confirmation that I was functioning, that life went on. It was true, but incomplete. The rest of the truth lived quietly inside me, shaping my reactions in subtle ways no one else could see. I noticed it first in small moments. The way I listened more carefully when someone spoke in fragments. The way I paid attention to unease instead of dismissing it as inconvenience. I stopped assuming that hesitation meant weakness or that decisiveness always came with certainty. That night had taught me something uncomfortable and necessary. Sometimes you act without full information, not because you're reckless, but because waiting for clarity can be its own kind of harm. I hadn't known everything when my neighbor knocked. I hadn't even known enough. And yet, doing nothing would have been a decision too, one I would have carried just as heavily. There were moments when doubt crept back in, usually late at night when the building settled into its familiar sounds. I would replay the night from different angles, questioning whether I'd misjudged the risk, whether I'd escalated a situation that might have resolved itself without my involvement. Those thoughts never lingered long, though. Each time they surfaced, they were met by a steadier truth. I had responded to a person in immediate need with the information available to me at the time. Not perfectly. Not heroically. Just honestly. That honesty mattered more than certainty ever could. I never heard from my neighbor again, and I came to understand that silence as intentional rather than negligent. Staying away was part of minimizing the damage, part of letting the situation lose momentum instead of keeping it alive through contact. I respected that choice. It mirrored my own desire to move forward without pretending the past hadn't happened. Whatever they carried with them, whatever path they took next, it was no longer something I needed to follow. Our lives had intersected at a point of crisis, and that intersection didn't require maintenance to remain meaningful. The apartment eventually felt like mine again, though not in quite the same way. The door was repaired, the splintered wood replaced with something sturdier, and the building returned to its quiet routines. Still, I noticed how my eyes lingered on the lock now, how my hand rested there a second longer each time I came home. That extra second wasn't fear, it was acknowledgement. An understanding that safety is active, not assumed. That you don't guard your life by pretending danger doesn't exist, but by recognizing it early and responding with intention rather than denial. What surprised me most was how little I wanted validation for what I'd done. There was no urge to tell the story widely, no need for approval or praise. The choice stood on its own, complete without witnesses. I didn't need anyone to agree with me to feel at peace with it. That peace came from knowing I hadn't abandoned someone in the moment they were most vulnerable, not because I was obligated to help, but because I chose to. Choice, I learned, is what gives an action its weight. And I was willing to carry that weight. There were still consequences, of course. Not dramatic ones, not life-altering in ways other people could point to, but internal shifts that couldn't be reversed. I trusted my instincts more now, even when they led me into discomfort. I accepted that morality doesn't always come with clean outcomes or guarantees. And I let go of the idea that doing the right thing would always be rewarded or even understood. Sometimes it simply becomes part of who you are, folded quietly into your sense of self. I thought often about the version of myself who might have looked through the peephole that night and chosen not to open the door. That version would have slept through the rest of the night, woken up to a quiet hallway, and carried on without interruption. On the surface, that life would have been easier. But I knew, with a certainty that didn't waver, that it wouldn't have been lighter. The unanswered questions, the imagined outcomes, the knowledge that I'd turned away when someone asked for help, those would have followed me just as persistently as the night itself had. I had chosen the burden I could live with. The choice I made didn't turn me into someone fearless or reckless. It turned me into someone honest about risk, someone who understands that safety and morality don't always align neatly. It taught me that sometimes the most important decisions are made in seconds, without witnesses, without guarantees, and without the comfort of knowing how the story ends. Those decisions don't ask whether you're ready. They ask who you are when readiness isn't an option. I still live my life carefully. I still value peace, routine, and quiet. But I no longer mistake those things for protection. They're preferences, not shields. What protects us, what really does, is awareness, empathy, and the willingness to act when a moment demands it, even if the action is imperfect and the outcome uncertain. That lesson didn't come gently, but it came clearly. And clarity, I've learned, is worth the cost. If I'm honest, the night didn't make me braver. It made me truer. Truer to the kind of person I want to be when choices arrive without warning and consequences arrive without mercy. I didn't save the world. I didn't fix a broken system. I opened a door, told a lie, and stood my ground long enough for someone else to survive. That was enough. It still is. I don't know what happened to the people who broke my door, and I don't need to. Their absence from my life is part of the boundary I've drawn since then. I don't chase closure where it doesn't belong. I carry what's mine to carry and leave the rest behind. That boundary, quiet, firm, and internal, is the real outcome of that night. Not the damage, not the fear, but the clarity that followed. And if you ever find yourself standing on the edge of a decision you didn't ask for, with too little information and too much at stake, I hope you remember this: doing nothing is still a choice, and sometimes it's the one that costs the most. If you've ever been forced to decide in seconds who you were going to be, share your story in the comments. Like, subscribe, and stay with this channel for more real stories about impossible moments, hard choices, and the clarity that comes after.